Jacob Wright, welcome to Unitarian Anabaptist.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. I happened to have the privilege of listening to a few of your interviews earlier, and I found you very fascinating, someone who could add great value to my channel. But before we begin into the serious questions, I'd like you to introduce yourself, explain your background, some of your activities, and then we'll get into the subject matter.
Okay, so I am a professor in theology at the Catholic School of Theology. I'm a Hebrew Bible professor, or Old Testament, and I am Jewish. I am the only non-Christian faculty member at the Catholic School of Theology and have been such for 15, 17 years. I came to Atlanta, Georgia, directly from Europe, where I had been there for 12 years pursuing studies. I had gone to Germany initially to work at the Dachau concentration camp with students from all over the world, and then I started to become very interested in modern German society and ended up staying there.
Wow.
But I was born in the New England area and spent much of my life throughout the United States, not least in Kansas City, Missouri, and I'm now a Southerner, a son of the South. Not really a son of the South, but an adopted son of the South.
Well, what a world traveler, huh?
Yeah.
In Germany, at Dachau. I didn't know that you were doing anything with Dachau concentration camp.
Yeah, it was a summer camp where we brought together students and from all over the world, and then we would work on basically maintaining the camp, and we worked in the city there. It was very interesting. The town of Dachau, which is right outside Munich, did not like having signs, and they wanted to change their town name, and they wanted to kind of erase the memory of that because the town was very complicit in it. Many different parts of the town had weird places where things happened, and they did not want signage around it. But in general, German society is not that way. And that's really what struck me, is that Germany has confronted its past in a way that many countries have not. Probably it's done a better job than any country in history in terms of admitting its culpability and really undertaking deep measures to change the way they were going about things. So I was very struck by how they were doing things and how thoughtful Germans are today. It's, the country has its problems, and but as a whole, it was just such an eye-opening experience for me in comparison to other European places like Austria and the Netherlands and so forth, but also the U.S. where.
So you actually, in a sense, felt welcome in Greater Germany.
Yeah, I mean, as a Jew, there were problems, but in general, I would say I didn't really want to think about once I started living there, I would say I stopped thinking about the Nazi past because that would have been too difficult. For example, the buildings that I lived in were beautiful places, like in Heidelberg, 500-600 years old, and you really didn't want to think about what happened in these places over the years and so forth. So you just kind of shut that off.
I see.
Then once I came back to the United States, I started thinking about that, and I actually became a very proud Jew. But while I was in Germany, I was very proud of what Germany had done, but I did not, present my identity too robustly because, I had a few incidents once I was attacked, and I had to, and I knew I had to be a little bit more discreet about.
Oh, is that right? So there were like.
Yeah, there are a lot of in all fairness, it was not Germans; it was Eastern Europeans living there who attacked me. But
wow! So I've got a daughter living in Germany, my second youngest. She married a Hungarian, and she lives about an hour from Frankfurt. And she actually visited a Jewish cemetery in that region that had gravestones that were from the 1800s. So it really brought to mind the Jewish presence there.
And one of the things that we did as a student I belong to a group where we went around to Jewish cemeteries that have been neglected, and and a lot of the stones were not standing any longer, or they had been desecrated, and neo-Nazi signs on them and stuff like that. So what we did was we'd go in there and we would take pictures of all the stones, and these go back hundreds of years. Very interesting witnesses to how Jewish life evolved and social life evolved throughout the centuries, the way they would write these inscriptions. And then we would publish them, and then people looking for their ancestors would be able to find out, okay, my ancestors are buried in Goslar. And while we were doing that, you would have a lot of Jewish people come from Israel or the United States, looking for their ancestors, and that was very interesting.
Yeah.
So what your daughter is experiencing is something that lies near and dear to my heart.
Okay, very interesting. Wow. Well, so if we could, let's get into the topic of interest here. So this is a good beginning. I think what becomes quite clear, something you mentioned in your response to Guy Powell in that interview you did on the Shroud podcast, you mentioned how the Jews were persecuted in the 3rd century BC after the Bible was put into Greek. And that's something, you said they had the audacity to say that there was only one God. So, in this world that we live in today, that many profess to be monotheists, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, but it's kind of strange to think, okay, so what does this look like when the Jewish narrative comes into the greater world, the Gentile world, and the Gentiles have to deal with this idea, this notion that there's only one God? Like, what does that look like in a 3rd century BC context?
Well, that's really not my area. And
okay.
I venture and say a few things about that. One of the most important parts of the 3rd century for my work is what happens within Palestine, ancient Israel, and what we call Judah, and that is the rise of the Maccabees.
Okay.
And the Maccabees are trying to reestablish a state, a kingdom, and whether they faced immense persecution or not, they presented it as a liberation from Greek oppression. And they reestablished the state that you would have had, like in the kingdom of Israel and Judah, before they were conquered. So like going back to the Davidic kingdom. Okay. And what's interesting for me is that Maccabean state is that moment of statehood that has a long tradition, and it's reestablished itself in the modern period with the modern state of Israel. And this is kind of the normal, what I would call plan A, the plan A of statehood.
Okay.
And what the Bible is about is this plan B, and that is a peoplehood. That is an attempt to think beyond the state and to imagine a political community that does not depend on kingdoms. And that when kingdoms fall, they're like the Maccabean state eventually did, that there would be a Jewish people around to live another day and to reestablish some kind of life, whether it's in exile or like in the modern state of Israel. So those are the things that are most important for me there. There was with respect to the Bible being translated into Greek, that happened not in Palestine, within the Promised Land, or Judah, or Jerusalem. It happened in Alexandria, where there was a diasporic community of Jews in there, and they wanted to understand the Pentateuch. That word is Greek itself, the 5 books of Moses in Greek, so that they could, study it in a deeper way rather than having to learn Hebrew. And but once that happened, the rabbis had trouble with it, because once it happened, it allowed others to read it and non-Jews to read it. And so what happens is then you have a situation which people in the Roman world who are starting to become quite anti-Semitic, Judeophobic, are looking at these Greek translations of the biblical text. And then, as so often in Jewish history, whether it be by Christians or Muslims or others, using the Bible against us, using the Bible against Jews. And it would be like a script that was very secret and for a group that they want to talk about things in their own way, becoming public and then causing all kinds of problems. And it's not like these texts were written with that in mind, that the world will one day be talking about it on podcast with you.
Yeah, right. Well, let me tell you a little experience I had. So I've been to Israel 4 times. The first time was in 2004. And, I guess at that time I was, 42 years old. Pretty naive in many ways. I was a Christian, but very naive in many respects. Mm-hmm. And I went into the Book of the Shrine Museum, where they have the scroll of Isaiah, this 40-foot scroll in the center there. And there was a rabbi giving some Gentiles a tour there. And he said, we gave the world the Bible. And I thought to myself, what do you mean you gave the world the Bible? And it was like, in my mind, I almost picture that this Bible fell from heaven, But no, I had to come to realize, no, this did not fall out of heaven. And in fact, later, I came to realize that this is actually the Jewish narrative. This is the Jewish narrative. This is what you call like the thing that makes the book that makes the people or unites the people of Judah in a time of defeat. Like it binds them together. So it's their narrative. And this has been in many ways co-opted by others and oftentimes misinterpreted or added presuppositions to. And, for Christians to be able to, what's the right word, to unwind this and to see it for what it really is something I think is vitally important. So this is something that I think you've thought about quite a bit.
Well, that's a really...
Is that correct?
Yes, I have. And I appreciate that story because it provides a really helpful point of contact with the problem that I had. And that is asking this question, so why do we have a Bible in the first place? And your understanding is the understanding shared by so many people. Basically, not asking that question at all and not really ever sitting back and thinking about it or wanting to think about it. And there are some people who still don't want to think about that. And what you saw in this shrine of the book in Jerusalem is the Bible is a very material thing. It comes through the experience of a people.
Yes.
And we can trace its earliest beginnings, perhaps, in the archaeological record. And we can see from the Qumran writings, the Dead Sea Scroll writings, how the Bible was beginning to be read in a wider society. And we can follow it through the early church in the Middle Ages, and how the New Testament writers were interpreting these scriptures, these Hebrew scriptures, as their Bible.
Yes.
Right? Paul did not understand his writings as the Bible.
No.
The New Testament authors as a whole point to the Old Testament as scripture.
Yes.
And it's strange, though, with my Candler students, these are budding pastors and theologians, but in their first years, they don't stop to think about that, it takes a Jewish professor in their seminary to get them to think about New Testament authors are talking about the Bible. The Bible is the Old Testament, and you have to kind of separate that back. You have to take a step back to appreciate that, because the New Testament, I would say, is an appendix. It's an appendix that is important for a amplification of this notion of peoplehood. Okay. It is moving from the Jewish kind of national community to a transnational, international community of faith, where it's not genealogical, it's not land-based, it's not language-based, it's not ethnic in that sense, but it is nevertheless that same concept of the people of God and being a people in the first place, a community of peoplehood. And
Okay.
and we can see how that just develops through the ages.
Okay. Yes. Very, very well. Well, I'd love to sit in on your class, but that's that's probably not possible.
It is, if you ever want to, we can arrange that.
I'm a little bit older than you, but anyway, yeah, maybe if I take a trip to Atlanta, maybe I could do that
Well, maybe
sometime.
on Zoom. I teach a lot online out there.
Okay. Okay. So, if you would you be willing to speak to us concerning like the project of writing the Bible in exile in Babylon? Like, what was how did all these stories? I presume they were oral stories that came together in the exile. Like, what do you imagine this project looking like, and how did it actually happen? Like, how did these things come together?
Yeah, going back to that material part of the Bible, that the Bible has a texture. The text is not just something that is disembodied and somehow revelation, but it actually grows as scribes are writing and connecting different texts, sewing them together. We can see how scrolls are sewn together. So that's kind of a metaphor for also how I understand the Bible evolving, and that is there are older traditions. There's older songs, older laws, older stories. Some of them were written down, some of them not. And you would have to imagine that in the period of these kingdoms, before the defeat, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, you would have had text.
Okay.
Text at the palace, text from the temple, and so forth. So, but those texts are not biblical texts in the sense that if we had just had those, that we would be reading them today. And we find so many of those kinds of texts in the archaeological record for Egypt and for Mesopotamia, for the great civilizations of Turkey and Iran.
Okay.
But they're found in the ground, right? And what we have in the Bible is something transmitted from generation to generation.
Yes.
And we can see at the period when everything collapses, this is my point, I'm trying to demonstrate this, when not in the high points, not in the times of David, not in the times of Moses and the liberation, but when all of that had been lost.
Huh.
That's when the biblical scribes, whether they're in Babylon or back in the land or elsewhere in Egypt,
Oh.
and throughout various different places, but primarily in Jerusalem, I would say, what they're doing is they're starting to think about what now. And then they're starting to find in their text, because that's what their profession was, a way forward. That they thought that their scribal craft and the kinds of things they produced and that they enjoyed amongst each other and shared and read amongst each that these texts could be the foundation for a new form of community. And so they're putting it together, and they're doing it in an aspirational way, because these texts don't get much traction for many centuries, even after the exile.
Oh.
It was in the time of the Maccabees where the texts really start becoming central to Jewish life. And after the destruction of the Second Temple, so like in 70 AD or CE, where Christianity starts taking off, Rabbinic Judaism starts taking off, and these texts, or text in these communities, become central because of the work of these scribes centuries earlier, who had the insight that there could be a community focused on a shared body of text, a body of text that would bring communities together and say, I find my story in this larger narrative, and I love the poetry, and I love the proverbs and all that. I have questions that these texts pose that are really central to me, and these texts also don't tell me this, and this you have to believe in order to accept this stuff. It's not about creeds, it's about questions, and questions that are fundamental to our existence and to all dimensions of our experiences, And there are profound answers to these questions. And there are also answers that are not found in these texts. And I want to bring them to the text. And that's where the commentary comes in. That's where you have New Testament come in. That's why Rabbinic Judaism has so many other texts, because what they set in motion was a conversation, and they wanted new text added to it.
Okay, so these scribes are writing like 500 years before Christianity. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say.
I mean, when you think in terms of 500 years, like our country, the United States, is 250 years old.
Yeah.
This is double that length of time. Now,
yeah, it goes back almost before the Enlightenment. Well, before the Enlightenment,
Yeah.
and the Renaissance, right?
yes. So I get what kind of, and you're saying these scribes were in, like, a lot of them were in Babylon, but you're saying they could have been in Egypt. They could, or you said in Jerusalem. So you think that there were scribes in Jerusalem during the exile that were writing at the same time there were in Babylon and possibly in Egypt as well?
Yeah, they're coming from all over, and some of them are in the north. Some of them come from the ancient kingdom of Israel. Some of them come from the Transjordan, and they have different traditions, and they're bringing them together. So it really is a project of connecting dots. And these scribes, we have to give them credit for it. They did not try to say, I have the best story and I want it to be the one that is the Amazon bestseller and that no one will read anything else. No, they try to say, my story, look at this, and your story there, let's try to connect them. Let's find a way of,
So they were sharing stories with each other.
I think they're sharing text. And I look at the birth of vernacular literature in the, I don't do it too much in the book, but elsewhere I do it, in the modern period, such as in northern Italy, where you start having the move from Latin writing to Italian writing. And it happened among notaries in northern Italy, where they are sharing text at night, what they write at night and compose as art. And it was just like the notaries, they had a particular function in this society, but it's very similar, right? That there was not a reading public at the time before you have Petrarch. It was primarily just professionals who would write and read, and the same thing goes throughout history. And I think it goes back to the time, as well as we find in Jerusalem, or Babylon, or Egypt, where they are sharing text across distances, and they're trying to find a way to connect them, and they have an idea that this should be in Hebrew, and that this community should know Hebrew and preserve traditions, and find what Heinrich Heine, this German poet from the 19th century, says, this portable homeland, so that the text becomes the land, it becomes the place, the space in which all kinds of important questions and memories and aspirations for the future are embedded.
It just seems to me that the forward thinking of this, I guess, would you call them a community of scribes? Is that the best way to describe it?
Communities of scribes. There's a review called them the tribes of scribes, so that they're different. The wonderful thing about them is we don't know who they are.
No.
And we know that they must have been in various places, and they must have worked over generations. So they're inheriting stuff from their ancestors, and they're adding a little bit to it. They're not revising them drastically. Sometimes that happens, but often it's just a text is written, and because it's going to, in the conditions of the land, texts don't stay around forever. So you have to update them. That's about every 40, 50 years. You have to make a new copy. But in the 40, 50 years, you would have a lot of things written on the margins, commentary, or an amplification, or someone adding something in between the lines.
Okay.
And then when the text was recopied, right, you wouldn't want if you were paying for a new text to be made of the book of Genesis, you would not want a sloppy thing. You would want all neat columns. And so the next scribe would then insert those lines and try to come up with a more flowing story. And every scribe did that by amplifying. We can really see where these glosses and lines and new paragraphs have been inserted into them. And that requires a lot of detailed philological work on differences in the language, differences in the vocabulary, contradictions, where we take a paragraph out and, see how that connects? And someone stuck that right in there. It has different language, different thought. It contradicts its passage. But look what it does. It also amplifies it and gives it a new... Now we have a story about some other community and how they connected with this community.
Okay. So I'm trying to... Well, I mentioned being in the Book of the Shrine in Jerusalem, seeing this, I think, what is it, 40-foot long scroll that's in the center?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So Isaiah was in...
The themes are, right? You can see where you don't have a piece of leather that long. So you have to connect it. And so that's also, like I say, that's how they must have been doing it in various ways of connecting different pieces into a larger tapestry.
Okay, so Isaiah was a historical prophet, correct? He was.
Yeah,
he existed.
Right. Goes back to a prophet in the Kingdom of Judah. Yeah.
Yes, and there's even some, I think, archaeological evidence of Isaiah, I think, found in Jerusalem and Hezekiah.
Hezekiah, yes, yeah.
Yes. So Isaiah would you say he was the appointed prophet for the kings of Judah? Like he would have occupied the office of prophet while Hezekiah was the king? Is that safe to say?
Well, you have to remember that the biblical model of one prophet at one time who was the one who spoke in the name of God, that is a construct from later scribes, from later times, to say each generation had its God-appointed scribe, like Elisha or Elijah, his predecessor. And then there were other, or God-appointed prophets, and then there's all these other prophets who are like the Baal prophets, or maybe Yahweh prophets, but they're false prophets. So to answer your question, Isaiah probably would have been one prophet among many. And the question is, like, why does his prophecy endure? Mm-hmm. Or why did the prophecies of Jeremiah, why do they endure in the sense that they get transmitted and amplified and that we read them today? And it's because I think that they are doing something that is intellectually significant, so that it poses questions that then later generations can pick up on and update and take it into new directions. So if you look at the whole book of Isaiah, we distinguish between first Isaiah, which is in the first 39 chapters.
Yes. I wanted to ask.
Second Isaiah begins in chapter 40, and it speaks centuries later, not centuries, but a good 130 years later, to the community in Babylon. After they had been exiled. And it begins with the Handel's Messiah piece, comfort ye, my people.
Okay.
It's not taken from Handel's Messiah, of course. Handel's Messiah is taken from it.
Yeah,
but
right.
And that's a very different language, very different topic and thinking. However, they connected these two together so that Isaiah becomes this, supra prophet that covers so many different centuries.
Yes. So, in your opinion, are the first 39 chapters of Isaiah original to Isaiah?
No. There are small portions, so that there are many different chapters from different times and places, even in the first 39 chapters.
Okay.
And I think that's pretty much what most biblical scholars today would say, that it's not, that you can't, Isaiah wasn't even writing. Isaiah tells people to, and like Jeremiah has the scribe named Baruch. And when Jeremiah speaks something, the scribe Baruch writes it down. Mm-hmm. and whether prophets could write or not is the question. Isaiah might be an outlier there, but yeah. And then there's all kinds of different things being, so that you can imagine some older portion of a prophecy that was spoken by Isaiah in a particular time. We call that the Isaiah memoir in chapter 6 through 8. And we can identify that as a really older kernel. But the first chapters are then prefaced, as so often in literature. Your very first chapters of a book are going to be often the latest chapters, because if you think about it, the first, like a preface is always written after the first chapter. The first chapter is usually not the chapter you're going to write. Once you have the core of it, then you start adding to it to introduce it. And then you also have new generations who want to reinterpret that. And so they provide a new lens by adding a new chapter to the front of it. And so I'm picking up here on my colleague, Sarah Milstein, her work. It's called, her concept is redaction through introduction. So kind of a new amplification through the first chapters that are added on.
Okay, so the ox knows its master's crib, but my people don't know me, right?
I want that to be Isaiah, but it doesn't really have to be. I would say that we have to separate the kind of great poetry and the great lines from some genius. Like this has to go back to a guy named Isaiah, because my whole point about this book is it's the nameless scribes.
Yeah.
We don't know who wrote Genesis 22, one of the wonderful stories of Abraham and Isaac. And James Goodman, this literary scholar at Rutgers, wrote a book, But Where's the Lamb? And he tries to imagine, like, who would have written Genesis 22? So if you look at Isaiah and you say, oh, that line, I love that. Can it be from Isaiah? Even if it were from him, that would be an insufficient way of trying to account for all of the biblical stories and of biblical literature and Proverbs and Psalms and so forth. The later Psalms are trying to be attributed, or the Psalms are trying to be attributed to, in these superscripts we call them, that this was written by David when he was on the run from Saul. And this whole move to kind of identify authors is a later move, and it goes past the kind of it misses the appreciation for the namelessness of so much of this stuff.
Okay, so when we think of the Bible as declaring the one God of Israel, and the faith that this one God of Israel, through his Spirit, through his breath, is inspiring this book to be written. Obviously, if a community of scribes can be putting together a narrative, this Jewish, or I guess you would say the Jewish narrative, there has to be some kind of inspiration here that allows them to do this masterpiece.
Well, the inspiration that I find is when two people, or two or more, or three, a larger crowd, when I'm with my students, for example, and we're sitting and studying together, and we're really there in a hospitable space, making room for really deep reflection, making room for people to make mistakes, and to try new ideas on for size, and to practice their Hebrew without anybody seeing that beyond the classroom, right? All of that happens in a very sacred space. And when you really, and you can imagine this also in your own experience, when you're doing that kind of intensive study, and you feel the kind of goosebumps sometimes, and I guess you would say the Holy Spirit is there. The Holy Spirit is there when two or more are gathered in my name, right? And so the way I imagine it is when scribes are really working together over generations and across geographical distances, and they're really thinking about, what now? How are we supposed to live? What is the whole meaning of this? Why did this happen to us? And they approach those questions without some kind of institutional agenda, or
Yeah.
they're not trying to accumulate power, but to really do things in an artistic way. And the way that artists or poets and so forth are not trying to sell poems, but to write a beautiful poem.
Yes.
That's where revelation happens for me. That's where the divine inspiration comes. And we don't need to imagine it as some kind of someone who loses their mind, goes into a trance, and just starts writing. Right? And if you ask a lot of Christians, this, like conservative Christians, that's how kind of they imagine it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
That they become over that the Spirit overwhelms them, and they just write, and then in those moments that's inspired. But when they go and write a letter to something else, that's not inspired because the Holy Spirit didn't. That's just
okay. So in other words, the notion that you're going to mindlessly start writing and it's going to turn out to be something spiritual, that doesn't happen. No.
Try to write something mindlessly and pray before and see if that works. It doesn't work. The best stuff that we produce is the best stuff that they produced, and it's all through hard work, sitting there and really thinking through things in a deep way, and also learning from others and connecting with others. It can't be all the greatest works of art in many ways. The movies that we like to watch are not just all produced by one person. They have help from a lot of different folks, and it's that collaborative nature that I want to emphasize.
But I think it's more than just a collaborative nature here, right? So like you're talking about one God who is, in a sense, partnering with human beings to produce something of such exceptional quality and value that it's going to last through centuries, through ages, and it's going to convey a thought about what this one God intends to do with this earth and humanity. Something along the lines of new creation. Like, do you see this in the scripture?
Yeah. So that for me is all those grand views of how we came here, how the world was created by one God in Genesis 1, and it wasn't created in the way that the Babylonian myths are telling us, and that was when Marduk slayed this female god and carved her carcass up and created this earth, but rather through the spoken word.
Yes.
And it was done in a time of where Tiamat is this female god, might be the same word with the same notion of the deep that is in Genesis 1 and 2.
Oh.
And the deep collaborates also with the creator, and they together form something. And that might be overstated, but nevertheless, the deep is not some kind of inimical force that has to be slaughtered. And so you have things that are very profound, but they're often in response to other things.
Okay.
So to imagine this kind of wonderful kind of grand blueprint just kind of all coming at one point in time and everybody agrees on it, I think that's not the way it worked. I think it's when like the author of Genesis 1 who looks at something and says, no. You know what's more powerful than the sword? Words.
Wow.
And you know how our God created the world? Through words. When he said, ye or let there be light. And our God enjoyed work and rested from it and looked back upon what he had created and said, it's good. Whereas the gods of Mesopotamia, they hate labor. And so they create humans to do the labor for them. And so you have the biblical authors saying, no, I'm going to take that and flip the script.
Okay.
And so much of it is in response to others who are like looking at stuff in their neighboring cultures or where they had been taken into exile by their captors. And they are saying this whole imperial myth founded on violence and on conquest is not the truth. The truth is much different. And that's when they go into that poetic mode of saying, here's the truth.
Wow.
And someone then says, yes, I like that. I'm going to take that and add to it. And I think that's a better way of understanding it than just some kind of prearranged plan that then 10 scribes work together on, already agreeing on all the parts.
Okay. So it actually, the scriptural account, the biblical account, is actually written in a special place of, what's the right word? It's actually anti-imperial, anti-kingdom of this earth response. So the framework of the creation story in the Babylonian account would have been supportive of the actions that they are taking to suppress the peoples of the world. And the Jewish account is coming from a people that is among those suppressed, who's saying, no, that's not the way that God operates, that the God operates. So it's written in response to this imperial system that has its own God framework that supports them in their actions.
Yeah, and it's definitely coming from a conquered people who are looking to something beyond the sword. They don't have the sword, or at least their sword is not going to be as powerful as Babylon's sword. Mm-hmm. And so they want to rethink power, and they do that as they move towards this monotheistic kind of worldview. That at the beginning there's Elohim. It's not Yahweh. Yahweh I tend to see as kind of a male deity that you could say he, him with, whereas Elohim in Genesis 1 is another name. It's not a personal name, it's just a title. It means God, and it's God, God's self. And there is no genealogies to this God. This God is just there. And we don't know the prehistory, what this God was doing before this. But they're trying to imagine that here is God, and God's spirit is hovering over the waters and wanting to do something wonderful and creating out of the deep and arranging it according to 7 days. And then this knowledge is transmitted to his people. The 7 days of creation is something that is really mystical, because we know if you were stuck on an island and didn't know what day of the week it was, you would definitely start to know when a new year comes and new seasons, and you could even figure out the months according to the moon phases. But what you wouldn't be able to do is the week. And so the 7-day week is transmitted to Israel, transmitted to the nation as this kind of understanding about a different way of things. They're telling us in Babylon that there's all these gods, and Marduk is the strongest god and so forth, but it's all wrong. The truth is that there's just one God, and he created the earth as good. And he told humans to be fruitful and multiply. And this vision of the world is to be like a gardener.
Yeah.
Not a conqueror.
Yeah.
A gardener and a builder and a creator, and one who uses words to do wonderful stuff with them. All of that is this counter vision. And that's one part of the monotheistic move. But a lot of the biblical texts don't want to be monotheistic in any really pure sense, because some of the Psalms and prophecies and so forth, they want their God to be stronger than these other gods. So they kind of enter into that similar kind of war between the gods.
Oh.
But they'll say that Yahweh has who is stronger than Yahweh? They don't say there are no other gods than Yahweh. Some texts do that. But a lot of texts say Yahweh is just the strongest, the mightiest, the holiest. And so it's a difficult thing to describe the whole Hebrew Bible as monotheistic. It's not like monotheism is everything's moving ineluctably to that goal. Some of it serves the message very well, and some of it, they want to kind of have their God in competition with other gods in order to make a claim, such as like Yahweh is using Assyria and its gods. He's so powerful that he uses these kings and their gods against Yahweh's people. So Yahweh is the highest, but there's these other deities and so forth that just are his instruments.
Okay. Well, I just wonder on that particular subject. So when a nation makes a god, like they make an idol,
Yeah.
and they attribute it to a god, they identify. Is there a sense that the nations create their own gods, and that these gods are actually not really a god, but just kind of the creation of the imagination of the nation itself?
Yes, and that's that concept that we find in the work of Second Isaiah that begins in chapter 40. So that's these scribes who are working in Babylon, and they are seeing all these idols around them, these icons and so forth. And they must have been magnificent. They would go to these majestic temples and see all this stuff. And these gods would be paraded around, like Marduk had a procession. So a lot of the stuff that we have in the Bible is a response to that, and a countervision. But within Second Isaiah, we have polemics explicitly against these things. And what they're trying to say in these texts is, you guys are so into these statues of Marduk, but you know what? All it is wood and gold and metal, and you guys are just claiming this. Our God is not a part of this whole system. Our God transcends the kind of attempt to place deity into one space, and then the idea behind an icon is that the one who controls that icon in the temple or the house of that deity then has power. And when your temple is destroyed, and when you're trying as scribes to think beyond priests and their domination or their monopoly over religious life, you would say God is not in any way to be fully identified with any icon, even with the temple. God can leave the temple, God can leave space, and can be transcendent.
Yes.
And God makes God's word known through the prophets to Moses. And if you really want to know, if you really want to see something that's holy, then look at these texts. Even though they don't treat the text as God in any sense, it is though that's the new icon. That's the new. That's something that people can copy, and it doesn't have to be, oh, you have only one version of this, right? The idols, there's only one version of that idol. You can't just replicate it and say, you can have your God anywhere you go, and you can just make a copy of him and bring him home. That's not the way it worked. However, you could copy text, and you could say, bring it home, copy it, and the more the merrier, the more we disseminate this. And that's so important for this community that is dispersed, to not have that kind of fixation on some kind of temple and temple personnel and land and all of that. They are really thinking beyond those kinds of concepts.
Okay, so on the topic of the future kingdom and resurrection, life in the age to come, how is that? Do you see that in the text that these scribes are writing? So what's that about? Like what?
Okay, so resurrection. You have it in a couple places in the Hebrew Bible, like Ezekiel's vision of the bones, the dry bones that take on flesh. But these are more kinds of poetic things. What they're very worried about is death. And they want to live. They want a community that will continue, that the children and Zechariah's vision of the end of days, when everything will be really wonderful, is when children are playing in the street, boys and girls, and old men and old women, or you can hear their canes on the street. So life on this God-given good earth is really where the attention of the Hebrew Bible authors are. And there were understandings of the afterlife and resurrection. And those understandings, though, become much more prominent in later times, and especially in the New Testament period, or in the, not period, but among these authors. But I think even for the New Testament, you have to be careful with the understanding that it's all, the modern Christian concept of it's like heaven.
Oh, yeah,
No. Like here's earth, and it really doesn't matter because this earth is going to be destroyed, and everything that matters is heaven, and we're just here in order to prove that we are faithful, and if we pass this test, then we go on. And that's a very different view than the Hebrew Bible, and it's what the Hebrew Bible has is what matters is here on earth, and I think the New Testament also is trying to do that in a much more major way than a lot of modern Christians understand it, and. Are you there? I think I lost you.
I am. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know what happened. Yeah, I'm back.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
Okay.
but Rabbinic Judaism comes up, starts to embrace resurrection, and the New Testament has resurrection in it. But in general, it's not as big as it becomes in post-biblical, whether it's the New Testament, post-New Testament, or post-Old Testament works. That whole idea, is to repeat this, is that like the fixation on heaven is probably not central to Paul. There's something that new happens with Christ's presence, so that the kingdom, there's an inbreaking of the kingdom in this present moment, and then there's going to be the already and not yet. At some point, that's all going to come to its fruition and fulfillment. Is it understood as like, when we die and go to heaven, that's when it all happens? No. And it's a deep mystical kind of aspiration where the Messiah comes back and where things start to, the kingdom of God is fully realized. What Jesus does in his first life, or the first appearance, and his death and resurrection inaugurates something new. And it's but they're living the Christian community is living in a time of despair, like the people of Israel and Judah after they had been conquered, and they are also looking for something to come, and the Christian community after the death of Jesus is looking for something to come. So both of these texts, their moments of origin are very much at this time of collapse and despair and darkness. And
that's so fascinating. That's so fascinating that you
look at the horizon and say, I see light there. I see it coming.
Yes.
And I know it is there.
Well, in your explanation here, I see so much in common with the community of scribes in exile, with the early Christians. Well, the apostles were thinking that this Jesus was their Messiah, and he's going to probably overthrow Rome and reestablish the kingdom and do all these great things. And then all of a sudden, they realize that the one that they expected to do all these things has been crucified at the hands of the Romans. And for a moment there, their hope is lost.
Yeah.
So the idea of Jesus, if in fact Jesus was raised from the dead, I believe he was, and I'm not going to ask you, but if in fact this is true, then they've got a very unusual, extremely unusual situation where the one that they expected to reign and rule on this earth is now raised from the dead, and he's put them in a place that they have to serve him, that they have to obey him. But it's kind of like in exile, like Jesus goes to heaven, and now they are serving this king, which is not on earth, but the powers of the earth is still present, So, and it seems like the idea of the resurrected Jesus as king is pointing to something, to a hope that they, in fact, will be raised from the dead and live in life in the age to come. So this idea of new creation, a new earth in which righteousness will reign, where God's justice will be done. This is actually an Old Testament, concept that comes into a new what'd you say, new context? Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I think that you would not have the New Testament that move to have the already not yet that's so central.
Okay.
Without that already not yet of the Hebrew Bible.
Yes.
So what you have after exile, after the conquest of the kingdoms, and the Judean kingdom is conquered in 587 BCE by the Babylonians, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Yes.
what you have after that is the biblical project really getting going, and that is an understanding that we're not going to get this kingdom back right now. The hope that David is going to be brought back and reinstituted, and we're going to shed the yoke of Babylon, and everything will be reestablished, and Jerusalem will never be conquered again, kind of thing.
Yes.
That many people were pushing for that, right? Just as you had many people in the early Jesus movement thinking that Jesus was going to dominate and would not die and would just, take on the empire, Rome rather than Babylon. But the New Testament authors, Paul being a good Jewish thinker, picking up on scribes that go all the way back to the making of the Old Testament, they are saying, not yet, not yet. What the Old Testament authors were doing, were saying, the Messiah is going to come. A new David will come, but not now.
Okay.
Right now, we have to wait. And we have to refocus our attention on the things that are going to preserve us until that time. And those are the most important things in general in life. Even if we had the kingdom, and especially if we had the kingdom, we might forget those things. And you know what those things are?
What?
Being a blessing. Being a blessing to all the nations.
Yes.
That was our first mandate, going back to our ancestors, Abraham and Sarah. What started this all in motion was not King David and not that kingdom, but rather something that preceded it, and it was to be a people, and to be the people of God, and to be a blessing to all the peoples on the earth, of the earth, and that we can still be that, or we can especially be that now that we don't have that kingdom and that political power, and then we will have that kingdom coming back. What form will it take? And that's where the prophets start imagining that, but their fundamental assertion is it's not now. It will come back. The fallen booth of David will be reestablished. And the New Testament authors then are saying that's the coming back that the prophets had foretold. What they do, though, is they add another not yet. So now the fulfillment of the prophecies happen with Jesus, but it's not all fulfilled as in these prophecies. There's another not yet, and that is the kingdom has been reestablished, but it's been in the hearts of the believers. And then so we have a move to create a kind of community, people of God, that is going to be refocused on being a blessing, on education, on all kinds of new ways of existing when you don't have power in the world, and waiting for that hope that everything's going to, be reestablished. And that's such a powerful move, because it allows people to maintain their hope. Yes. And in the meantime, it allows them to do something that they can actually do. And that is to worship God, and to study, and to work on this God-given good earth, and to not see labor as something that the gods imposed upon us because they're so lazy and that kind of stuff. All of those new ethoses that permeates the Hebrew Bible is central to the Christian community too, as they are trying to survive in a world in which they don't have power.
Mm-hmm. So it also seems to me like the judgment of God, the future judgment, where there's a separation between people that want to participate in God's work and those who don't want to participate. God is not going to include the ones that don't want to be included. He's going to gather together those that want to participate in the future kingdom, who will work in that kingdom. and make this earth a beautiful place. So that it seems to follow, like the Bible, the continuity of the Bible seems to be, throughout. I see it throughout the Old Testament, New Testament. There seems to be a continuity, and in the beginning you have the Garden of Eden, and in the end you have a Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
So it's beautiful. So what you see happening is the Bible is actually a living work that is building upon itself and developing in a way that it just makes a beautiful picture out of what God's plans and purposes are for the earth and for humanity. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. It is a really, for me, awe-inspiring attempt to show how ideas matter, right? Mm-hmm. It's ideas that sustain us.
Yes.
And it's hopes in the form of these ideas and rethinking older ideologies and propaganda and received truths and so forth. And when you have an earth that you look around and see a lot of bad stuff happening among peoples and nations and kingdoms, mm-hmm. but look how beautiful nature is.
Yes.
To say all this bloodshed,
yes,
all this greed,
yes,
is one thing, and
yes.
then there's this other thing, this earth and animals and
yes.
newborn babies and
yes.
love and so forth is another thing. And then to separate those and say, well, what is this? We're going to set that aside, and
yes.
we're going to try to be more focused on this beautiful God-given earth. Wow. And figuring out how we can really live in keeping with the truth that is embedded in this creation, and yes. that then is also then now found in the text that we are reading, and that tell us about a different way, a new heaven and a new earth that will one day make it impossible for these empires to have their way, and that this cannot go on forever.
Right.
It's just like there's a conviction that these kinds of these ambitions to control and dominate and so forth are destined to perish. Right?
Yes.
Because they see them. Kingdoms come and kingdoms go. Empires come. And yes. the book of Daniel talks about there was the Assyrian, the Babylonian Empire, the Medes and the Persians and the Greeks. So they just see a succession of empires.
Yeah, right.
And they look back and say,
yeah,
you know what the real one is? It's the empire of God. And it's a different kind of imperial power.
Right.
It's when people will come to Jerusalem to learn and study the ways of Yahweh. And it's not going to be through some kind of traditional armies conquering and right. establishing by force.
Yes, this kingdom is won by self-sacrifice. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wow, this has been a beautiful interview. We've used up the time that you've allotted me. But before you go...
You can come back on some other time if you want.
Well, I'd love to do this again. This is a very good beginning. Maybe you can put a plug in for your book. And is this what your book deals with, this type of material?
Yeah, it's called Why the Bible Began, an Alternative History of Scripture and Its Origins. And it's with Cambridge University Press, but it's now on the best of list, like the New Yorker's best of and so forth, which is what I'm trying to do in the book is to lay out why the Bible matters to us and how to see it, both as believers and non-believers, that you do not have to come at this with somehow faith, that you look at this text and you say, there's something compelling about it, and maybe faith grows out of it. But yes. what I'm trying to get away from is the kind of attitude to the Bible that it's only for believers. The Bible has so many different things that are that we would probably think are improbable to be in the Bible. You know, like the Book of Esther. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. And it seems to make a point that there are various possibilities. And if you really want a community, you have to create an openness that they can come and be inquisitive and curious and ask questions and answer them in ways that are not going to be acceptable to others. But you know what? They're still coming and they want to have a conversation. And that's what I work with my Candler students with, creating that community around questions and curiosity rather than answers and creeds.
Yes.
And that's the magical part of these texts, like good stories. A bad story is you read it and you don't want to, you know the answers and it's all one.
Right.
A good story is one that you have to reread because every time you read it, you think about something different and it's not easy. And that's what these texts are. And they're not clear-cut theology. They do have coherence. They do have, like we talked about today, very similar patterns of dealing with devastation, both in the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible. And there are all kinds of pieces that come together in really beautiful ways. But it's not all just perfectly aligned so that it only means one thing. It has dimensions to it that can only be unpacked when we all, as members of communities, come and bring insights and unpack that text from our own perspectives. And that's why we need a lot of people instead of just the pastor telling us what we're supposed to believe from the Bible. So I try to show that and how that all works together and what this whole thing is in terms of the making of the Bible and why we don't have Bibles from the Philistines or the Moabites or the Egyptians. And that's really crazy, right? To think about it. And going back to your point about the shrine of the book, there is a material history here. And if you really love the Bible, you'll want to know that history. And the stuff I'm telling you is in this book is not in order to undermine faith, but to actually give new dimensions to it and to help you appreciate it in a way that's going to be edifying to your own journey.
I just can't imagine what it takes to write such a book and how much thought had to go into this, how much courage on your part too to really challenge norms. But I really appreciate.
Well, I know that you, Tom, are doing that a lot, and that's why I wanted to come on. I've watched your videos, and I know that you're a very curious individual, and that you have appreciation for me as a Jew to be able to speak my own views. And I really appreciate that hospitality, but also your courage in order to say things that some people are not going to be comfortable with, but the Bible gives you the license to do that. There are a lot of different views, and it wants readers coming at it over and over again rather than giving them something that kind of a gatekeeper kind of thing. You can't come unless you believe this. That's just not in keeping with the genius of these texts.
Yes. Well, I thank you for coming on. I really appreciate this time spent. And I look forward to a continued conversation. So,
let's do it again sometime, and we'll talk more about the how this all fits in with the early church and stuff. I'll look forward to hearing and learning from you too.
Okay.